I've seen a lot. Amid the celebrity allure of entrepreneurship, many exceptional entrepreneurs remain shadowed. Here, I team up with these hidden talents to unveil their challenges and successes. Dive in with me to unearth entrepreneurial gems, learn from our experiences, and get educated. Hey, buddy. What's going on, man? Thanks for coming to...
awesome day in Toronto.
Thanks for coming to Canada from New York from San Francisco via New York. And appreciate you coming, brother. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Curt Cronin back. This is your third time on the podcast, but this time we're doing a mic swap, and you're going to interview me as part of the series that, we've said this before, but we've had some requests to get to know the host, and, we've been doing this now just over 11 months. And so, I guess we're going to have a conversation today. We had a conversation a few weeks ago with my cousin Charlie about business, and we're going to talk about, personal growth and overcoming obstacles and some of the things that I've overcome. And so I'll, you're the host today. So welcome and thank you. Appreciate your generosity, and I'm super grateful as always for being a brother. And
absolutely honored and ecstatic to be here. Of all the roles you played for me, mentor, friend, Spartan, partner, brother over the years, the only difficulty I've ever had is getting you to talk to you about yourself. So the opportunity to have 3 hours where I get to pepper you with questions, this is a dream come true.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I freaking hate this part of it, but whatever. I mean, it's, we've been asked, and I think it's only fair to, share with people kind of, some of my story, and hopefully it relates. And, and that's what the podcast is all about. So I would be a hypocrite if I didn't kind of put myself out there and be open to, I'm happy with sharing and happy exploring and all that kind of stuff. And, I've said it a million times before, but I've made about every mistake on a multitude of times. So, I feel like I've had extra reps than most people, because it's like I keep messing it up, and it's like, as I say, I'm not the crispiest chip in the bag, but eventually we get through it. So anyways, thanks for coming, brother.
And I'm really excited for the audience to get a chance. I've had the chance to know you for 15 years, but that's still a tiny glimpse of the experience and the time that you've had in life. And so I'm really excited to dive in. If you were to speak to 7-year-old Dwayne, what would you want to tell him based on everything that you've experienced in life to date? If you were to go back and talk to 7-year-old Dwayne, what would be the key conversation, the key things you'd like to relate back to that 7-year-old?
I would say, hold on, bro. That would be probably what I would say. I mean, it's been an unbelievable ride, and we've talked about this before, but it's like, when you look at your life, and I think, people, if you kind of think about this, for the audience, like when you think about your life and you look back on the path and you go, how did I get here? You could never have predicted, what would have happened or what could have happened. And, over time, grace has just continued to show up, or the universe, or serendipity, or whatever you want to call it, has shown up and time again to help me get to, where I am. Now, and that's not necessarily like where I am is not anything necessarily special. It's just where I am. And it's been a crazy path, but, maybe not 7-year-old Dwayne, but, there was a lot of planning, a lot of stress, like been pretty driven. I remember, I was driving down, the 401 one day, and with my parents in the car and my sister, and I was young, like maybe I was 12 or something like that. And, I remember my dad said to me, I remember this distinctly, we were driving by some high rises and some skyscrapers, and he said, hey, maybe, I don't think we were probably down on the QEW right near Toronto City Center. And he said, maybe someday you'll work in one of those towers. And I said, no way, man, I'm going to own one of those towers. And that was kind of like, I was like that since from a young age. I don't know how old I was then, but Yeah, I'd just say, I guess I'd say buckle up. It's crazy. I've had an insane life. When you ask that question, it actually reminds me of a story. Like a couple of years ago, I was at a funeral for a friend, died way too young. But I go into the funeral home to the celebration, the viewing, and it was insane because there's an old friend from years ago, in my past where I was, probably not the most desirable citizen in the world. And, there's, patched gang members from a 1% bike club. There's drug dealers, there's business people, there's doctors, there's lawyers, and I just think wow, how crazy has this life been to come from where I was and, the balance and this, this whole journey to where I am today. And it's been a crazy, incredible ride. So buckle up would be the words in the short answer.
I love it. And for the audience, Dwayne and I almost didn't have a relationship because I saw him at a level that I'm like, well, I could never be like him. So we almost didn't have a relationship because I almost didn't have the first conversation with you. And so if you were to say, what's the most surprising thing about where you are now versus where you were at the beginning?
I don't know if in a lot of ways that I'm really much different, but maybe just evolved and a little bit more polished. But I said this to you, this was at the top of the Hyatt in San Diego when we first met. And, you ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't seen Curt Cronin's previous episodes, you should watch them. But Curt is an ex-Navy SEAL. I don't know if you're ever an ex-Navy SEAL, but you're no longer retired Navy SEAL. But, you've done some crazy ass shit and, you've been through a lot of harrowing experiences and you were in a business environment and you were having trouble connecting. I was like, dude, you have skills that other people don't have. And I'd say that not just to you, but I'd say it to anybody listening. I'd say it to myself. It's like, I have skills, that other people don't have, and other people have skills that I don't have. That doesn't make anybody better or worse. It just makes us different, but it allows us to add value to other people's lives because we have a different perspective, a different outlook, a different set of experiences. And so in my life, I've tried to create as many experiences as I possibly can, without going to jail, which some days it's like when I look back, I'm blown away that's not where I ended up. It's I don't know if I just answered your question, but that was kind of what popped into my head. It's like, it's a crazy life, but I would say we put so much expectation on ourselves to perform or to get an outcome or to get a result. And that pressure that we put on ourselves is undue, not necessary. I think a certain amount of pressure is good, but not a negative pressure, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the things I admire most about you and watching you. And one of our earlier conversations, you talked about, oh, you're from the military. You rehearse, and maybe someday you'll do the thing. In my world, I do the thing every day. I love any of your context or perspective on execution.
Well, so if I would kind of, I think execution, it's an interesting word and it's an interesting phrase, and execution is an important thing, but it's one part or one component. I think there's, a lot of things that need to come before execution. Things are done twice. We've talked about this before. They're done twice. They're done first in your mind, and then they're done in the physical realm. And so, the execution really should be, and this is one of the things I like about the model of the Navy SEALs, which is, you guys train. And in our world, what I would suggest is that it's maybe not necessarily, train, but it's think, evaluate and then, execute. So it's maybe, aim, shoot, look at where your what happened with your execution, then aim again, shoot again, then look at what your results were. Are they similar? Are they completely different? Aim again and start to get some dots on the board or some holes in the paper to kind of see, okay, is my execution on target? Is it the right execution? And I think, to your point, it's like you can aim, and it's paralysis by analysis, and then never execute. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that happens. It could be your beliefs that you're not worthy or whatever. You need too much certainty before you can, pull the trigger on something, or you have been, have a story about, failed attempts in the past. So there's a fear of failure or a fear of ultimately, most fears really end up in the realm of, I'm not enough. And if I'm not enough, like if I fail, I'm not enough. And if I'm not enough, I won't be loved, by the ones closest to me or the ones that I need respect from or admiration from or whatever it is. And so, execution is, to me, a really very small part of the whole process. Because once you execute, it's done, right? It's like it becomes a past experience. And then you have to figure out, well, what do I do with the information gathered from execution to make the next execution even better or more accurate or more on target? And so that would be, that's my kind of...
And I feel like that's absolutely one of your superpowers is creating your own story, creating the story that you desire to drive execution of, that you love to make. So I would love, do you know where that came from? Have you always been a creator and said, I'm going to create my story, I'm going to create that which I want? Or was that something you learned along the way that, hey, if I want to execute, if I want to get to where I want, like, was it natural? Was it something you adapted based on all your experiences?
It's a good question. I have my story is really not, there was a long time where I didn't admire myself for my story. I would say, first off, like my emotional home is anger and rage. And I struggled with anger and rage for years. And it led me, I would kind of, Tony teaches this thing, it's called a crazy eight. So like, I would be in anger and rage. And then I would, once I, went through anger and rage, then I would go to this kind of sadness. I don't know if I'd call it depression. There were moments in time in my life where I had been depressed, but I would just call it in general sadness because of disappointment in myself for not being able to control anger and rage, but I never understood it. And when you don't understand something, you can't influence it. And so, I spent all this time in, anger and rage and when I look back on it now, I have a different perspective of it. But in the moment, it was anger, rage, sadness, disappointment, because I knew like I wasn't, that person. I believe I'm like a love bug. I've got a lot of sensitivity, I'll cry during a Hallmark movie or something. And, I'm a pretty sensitive guy. And I love people and I want the best for people, but this anger and rage would take over my life, and it caused me to do some, really shitty things to people, and that anger and rage actually also met a lot of my needs too. And so, when something meets your needs at a high level, you become addicted to it or very attracted to it at a high level. And so I went through a period of time, years, where, fear, like I kind of lived as the consciousness level of a power god, right? I used fear to control people, get what I want, to puppet master. And there's still people in my life now today that knew me in the old days that are like, you know, the last thing like they want to do is get me into a rage, because it's like, where's the fucking body bag? and you know, and I had a really hard time, you know, getting to that point where I could learn to appreciate what I learned from it, what it brought to me in my life, how I overcame it. And because I knew on the other side, like I was like one of two people. I had this anger and rage, and then I had this like side of me that was like a leader, an inspirational person, like super motivated, super driven, wanting to help others. And like I remember one time my car got towed. I was working at a bar, and I came out, my car got towed. So I go to the place where they have they've towed it. And there's these three guys, and they're creeping on a girl, and they're really being, you know, derogatory and doing things they shouldn't do. They're like really treating her like shit. And so I remember going over and saying, like, you know, defending her and saying, hey guys, like, this is not okay. Like, leave her the fuck alone. And all of a sudden they turn on me. And so one thing leads to another, and, you know, we get into a fight, and, you know, I beat the shit out of two of them. And the other guy is like, okay, fuck, I'm good. And then I felt so bad. It's actually probably a pretty good example, but I felt so bad. I throw the two guys in my car, well, the three of them, I throw them in my car, and I drove. One of the guys needed to go to the hospital, and I drove them to the hospital and dropped them off because I felt so bad. It was like the loop happened so fast that I would go from anger and rage down to this, into this, you know, disappointment thing, and then regret and all those, and then spiral these emotions that I guess at the time were sometimes uncontrollable. And then I just went, like, it just created so much pain that at some point in time, I figured, like, I gotta move beyond this. This is not healthy. It's not sustainable. I'm not, I'm not contributing the way I want to contribute, because in my real nature, I believe I'm a love bug, and I want to serve others at like a low level, not like now. And you know, that was kind of like the early stages of my story, where it almost felt like somebody was like tearing me in half. Like, I have my head cover on my golf clubs today is the Hulk, right? And that's kind of how I felt. It's like when everybody goes, hey, if you were going to be a superhero, who would you be? I'm like, I'd be the Hulk, because that's who I was in the past. Is like I had these two people inside me that was like, you know, rage and then love and caring.
And I'd love to play here, because I think this is you're highlighting one of the greatest challenges for human on the planet today. I think there's such a prevalence of violence, because I've been on the seal op where it feels really good when you're jocked up and you're with your boys, and like you feel that surge of adrenaline, and it's addicting for people to have that. And then there's also then the downside of that, where all of a sudden the crazy eight you were talking about, now I'm going into withdrawal. And can you talk through how the process you've gone about to integrate? Because I think most people, the limitations in their life are that they choose one or the other, and they don't go through the process that you've gone through to integrate the two and to get the yes and instead of the either or. Because it's bouncing back and forth, is not being able to, in my perspective, not being able to hold the field of awareness to say, oh, why am I going through this cycle? And how did you go through it? How did you break the cycle?
Well, I mean, you know, I couldn't share the story of like how the timeline went of how I did it. I mean, probably could piece it together over hours of conversation, but I do
We've got
know,
all night.
like I knew I was destined to be more, to have more, to do more, to be more. And so with that in mind, I started to seek out role models. Like that was I've always had a mentor since I was 18 years old. And so, whether I was listening to them fully when I was younger is another thing, but I was on that track. So like I was not a complete lost soul. And like I said, it's like really, it's literally like the Incredible Hulk. 50% of the time I'm this way, or 40% of the time I'm anger, rage, and 60% of the time I'm love bug, motivated, driven, all that kind of stuff. So, I've thought a lot about like the topic of mastery, not to get into mastery to change it, but the first step in my mind of mastery is skills. And so when I started to look at like, okay, what do I need? Is like, so I went on this hunt for skills. I read a tremendous amount of books. Like I met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, which is not unusual for a lot of people. But I read like hundreds of books, and which was a really difficult task for me because when I was younger, I read like at a very low level, kind of grade 4-ish level, like the cow jumped over the moon. Like I literally would read word for word through a book. It was painful, but I read a lot of books, and then I first started working with the Covey Institute. And so I would go down to Salt Lake City to the Covey Institute, and I would listen to Stephen Covey speak. I was teaching his time management course, the Franklin Planner. And so I had access, and so I was starting to, like feed my brain with some knowledge and start to develop some skills. And then, we've talked about it before. I've been with Tony for a dozen years and done, listened to a whole bunch of other speakers and, Zig Ziglar and Jim Rohn and all that kind of stuff. And so I really, really started to flood my mind. And then kind of early on in my years with Tony, I started to kind of develop some kind of pieces. And now I call them, but at the time I didn't, but now I call them like forces at play. Meaning, what are the forces at play that are kind of coming to me? So I've got myself to about 10. One is needs, the 6 human needs. Then the other is, pain versus pleasure. And I'll go through these with you, but identities, primary question, meaning and story, state, the need to be right, values, beliefs, rules, saboteurs, there's 6 of them, and blueprint equals current life condition. And so those to me are the things that I worked through over the years. And I'm a bit of me, I'm a pretty structured guy. I've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes and journaling, and I go through a course or I read a book and I'm like, I'm making notes and I'm grokking out like here, what are the top one thing? If I read a book and I walk away with one thing that I can work on, I will work on it, and just like pour a ton of focus into it. And so the first one was, the 6 human needs, right? There's 6 human needs: certainty, significance, love and connection, variety or uncertainty, and then growth and contribution. And so, that's kind of like, those are like, so when anything kind of, I feel angst or there's something popping wrong, and I'm, I don't feel congruent or, my wife and I get in an argument or, something, somebody gets me like, I can start to feel like, the Hulk coming out.
You start turning green.
And it's like, yeah, and I feel, and now I'm like, I understand my physiology more. I feel it. Like for me, it comes from my chest and it's like, so like live. Like you said, like, you get into that like battle mode. And so, I use those needs and I go, okay, like, am I being significant in this moment? And so I use those needs to try to evaluate every time something starts to go wrong. And even in the littlest of things, I will go, what was that? Like, so I can identify it. And so that I build my awareness. Like the awareness was the core. The awareness that, what I was doing was A, not right. for others, not right for myself. I was being unfair to them, to me, and that if I was going to be something different than I currently was, if I wanted to be better, I needed to get better. And so I started to create acute awareness around that. So I used the 6 human needs to kind of really hone that in. And, with the understanding on, especially on the needs, is like, if you give up your values, you'll give up your values, your beliefs, and your rules in order to meet your needs. It's one of the most powerful forces that drive us. The need for certainty, which is the need for security, the need for safety, the need for control, the need for predictability. And then I think the other one I said was significance, which is, again, that's control, the need like to have respect, to have recognition, legacy, those kinds of things. And we can meet our needs in 2 ways, empowering ways or disempowering ways. So when I would turn into the, anger and rage, I was meeting the need for certainty, significance, loving connection, because I was connecting to myself. There's that, when you get ranked up, you're like, you just feel so powerful within, and that's a huge connection to yourself. And then, there's variety, which is, common sense. I don't need to explain them all, adventure, that kind of stuff. But, identifying that and understanding that meeting your needs, you will give up all the things that you value, believe, and the rules you've created in your life. Like, I will never cheat. Yes, you will. If it meets your needs, you will. If your needs aren't getting met here, you're going to get your needs met. And so really understanding that I had to figure out how to meet my needs and not meet them in a disempowering way, but meet them in an empowering way.
And it sounds like the amazing part of the process you went in to take all those incredible principles you talked about here, the forces of play. They weren't just intellectual concepts. You now took your emotions, your energy and motion, whatever you're experiencing in the moment, and we're able to now say, I am more than my emotions. And so what I heard you say is, okay, I'm having this emotion. What is it about that that's driving it? What need is driving it? And by figuring out what need is driving it, it allowed you to start to say, okay, now how do I want to get better? Right? That drove your integration process. Am I hearing that correctly?
No, it's 100% right. So like there's 3 levels of learning, right? The first is intellectual. So we understand it cognitively. We get it in our brain, we read it, we understand it, and we go, okay, yeah, I get that. And then the second level of learning is emotional, right? It's like when you attach a consequence, and the consequence is the emotion. So it allows us to learn at that level, right? Where it's like, okay, if I do this, this is going to be the consequence, like, no way. I create emotion around it. And then the third way of learning is physical, right? I get it in my body. I do it over and over, consistently, over time, and it digs into my physiology. And then once it's in your physiology, it becomes part of your identity. And in identity, which is one of the forces at play, is like, once it's in your identity, like the most powerful force in the human psyche is to remain congruent with how one identifies themselves. So if you identify yourself as a bad person or a lover, or you identify yourself as a victim, one of the saboteurs, then you will do whatever it takes to reinforce and be congruent with that identity upon which you've chosen to identify yourself. So it's these are all the things, like there's pain and pleasure. That's one of the other forces. So the pain and pleasure is like we move. People will do more to avoid pain than they will to gain pleasure. So I have to be very careful. It's like, if I'm not having this conversation, whether it's with my kids, my wife, in my business, my church, whatever, because that conversation is going to be conflict for me, and I'm a person that wants to avoid conflict, which I'm not. But if you were,
Present.
But you may avoid a necessary and important conversation to move something forward or move yourself forward, regardless of the pleasure that you see on the other side if you had the conversation, because we're wired to avoid pain.
And that's one of the key things, a gift you gave me as a people pleaser. I would avoid conversations, and some of our conversations you helped me to see, but what if I wanted someone to become CEO, CMO, whatever it is, 30 or 40 years down the road? then I have to have that conversation with them. So rewired my desire as people pleaser based on changing the outcomes. And so what's fascinating about the process you've gone through, how did you take, people could have said a setback or a failure, and that could mean, okay, now I am a failure. If that becomes my identity, and now manifest those. Your life has not been perfect. How did you take those setbacks? What story did you tell to allow those setbacks to become waypoints for progress? How did you rewire that?
Meaning and story is one of the forces at play, right? So it's like, if something happens, something negative in my life happens, what I learned to do was, Byron Katie writes an amazing book called Loving What Is. And so, that was a pivotal book that I read years ago. And, she essentially goes through 4 questions. Something happens. Like when something happens, an event occurs, we attach a meaning. And the meaning that we attach creates an emotion. And emotion is where we live. And so, and it's funny. It's like, well, so many people go, and like you just said, it's, you go, well, when something bad happened or something negative happened and influenced your life, it's like, okay, well, one of the things that I've learned over time is like suffering is not in the fact, it's in the perception of the fact. And so when an event occurs, I'm extremely careful about the meaning that I choose to attach to that event. It is like, it's extremely important to me. And there's a couple of pieces in that I help to influence myself. Like first of all, there's 3 questions that we're all constantly asking ourselves. What am I focusing on? What does it mean? And what should I do about it? And so that focus, and I constantly say on the show, where focus goes, energy flows. That's a saying from Tony. It's like where focus goes, energy flows. What am I focusing on? And it's like, well, am I focusing on the negative or am I focusing on the positive? Is this happening for me or is it happening to me? Essentially, what I do is I ask a whole bunch of questions that I've primed myself with or prepared myself with. I have a list of questions on my notes section in my phone that's like endlessly long. It would be pages if you printed it out. And so and I've learned over time. So I used to write the questions out, and I would when I would start to feel like something come up, whether it's sadness or disappointment in myself or regret or anger or rage, I would start to ask myself and go, is this true? Is it absolutely true? Who am I with this thought and who am I without this thought? Those are the 4 questions from Byron Katie's book, Loving What Is. And so, it would be a continuous series of asking these questions. What am I focusing on here? I'm focusing, I'm focusing on the negative. It's like, okay, well, what's the positive to this? What's the other side to the coin? And if you focus on negative things, you're going to attach negative meanings. And if you attach negative meanings, you're going to have negative emotions. You want to change your emotion, change your meaning. And so in order to change the meaning, you have to ask the questions. How's this happening for me? Is this true? Who would I be without this thought? It's like, you're pissed off, you're angry, you're frustrated, you're depressed, you're sad. It's like, who am I with this thought? Well, that's easy. Well, who would I be without this thought? Well, I'd live in grace. I'd be thankful. I'd be appreciative. I'd be understanding. Maybe I'd be empathetic. And so you have to reverse, the process. And it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of, I'm very careful to not use the word discipline, because the word that I really believe that gets underused is commitment. It's like, am I willing to pay the price to be who I want to be or to get what I want to get? And ultimately, that was one of the bigger questions that I had to face is like, am I willing to do the work? Am I committed to being the person that I want to be? And then then it's like, well, a lot of people, like back then I was like, well, I don't even know who I want to be. Like, I don't know what I want to be. I don't know who that is. It's like, I didn't have an identity for who I was. I burnt a marriage, and, today my ex-wife's one of my best friends. I had to recreate an identity of how to be an ex-husband. But I hadn't created an identity how to be a good husband in the first place, because I didn't understand. I didn't have the skills. I didn't have the first level of mastery to be able to figure out, like, man, like, I didn't know. I was unprepared. I was uneducated. And truthfully, I didn't have the level of consciousness and I was like completely into myself, which was, I was into my business, because that was what was really important. That's how I identified myself. It's how I met my needs for significance, met my need for certainty. I did meet my need for love and connection, because I had staff and I was helping them and I was coaching them, and it made me feel good. And I was useless at home as a husband because I didn't know how to do it. And I had to get skills. I had to read, but, I blew a marriage doing that. And not that I'm, not saying like, oh my God, like I blew a marriage. Lots of people blow marriages. And, you have to, I mean, that's a perfect example of an event that is, not the most optimal. What do you call it? Less than optimal, LTO. Yes. So it's like, it was an LTO event in my life. And so it's like, and it hit me hard. I was raised Catholic. I was taught to love, honor, and obey. My parents had been married before they passed away for 55 or 57 years. And it wasn't the model of my world. So when it happened, I mean, I knew it had to happen because we were different people. And then, coming out of it, and it took time. This was not the first week or the first year, and it took years. But I started to re-engage a new identity and look at it and go, how's this happening for us? Like, how can we be better at co-parenting as a separated or divorced couple versus being an unhappy married couple trying to parent? And I just attached a new meaning to it. A meaning of not regret, not disappointment, not failure.
And this is such an epic PhD in leadership. There's so many directions to go. So it sounds like in all situations for you, there's the moment you have an awareness that something's different than where you want to be. In the case of the guys that you fought, you had the awareness, hey, I'm going to defend the girl. Then the awareness of, that's not the way I wanted to do it. And so you have an awareness. Then you begin the process of, okay, what would I like to have done differently? Wow. And so SEALs would have called it after action review, but you seem to have an uncanny, I love your word, commitment to, I'm going to improve whatever awareness I have, the gap between who I am and who I'd like to be. I'm going to go through whatever it takes, read the book, find the mentor, whatever tool it takes to drive that. And you spoke about it takes time. As I was sitting here listening to you talk about when you get into a charge, you go through Byron Katie's questions. Like, that's amazing, because so many times I don't. I go straight off the edge. And so are there times when you say it takes years? I know for myself, I used to have stories I would hold on to for 15 years. My mission now is, hey, can I surrender more rapidly so I can, in the moment, surrender? Can you talk about how that process has worked for you, from having awareness that's not there into now I've watched you hold center in almost every situation.
Yeah, because you met me before this was a massive problem. So I was very much I was like a fucking jackhammer, right? It was like something happened and boom. And it's a lot of times people would be like, what the hell just happened there? Like, it was really instant and fast.
That's where we initially connected. I'm like, oh, this is like the SEALs. If the whole world looks like a hammer, if I have a hammer, the whole world looks like nails.
Exactly. And so, sorry, what was the question again? Like,
for me, where I'm guessing many people struggle is okay, that sounds fantastic. Like I started to get angry and I asked myself these powerful questions and I go through a process, and my fear would be many will say, well, I didn't ask myself the questions. I went off the ledge. So I'm now not going to have the commitment to go through that process. So I'm fascinated when you found yourself in failures, setbacks, blown opportunities. How did you then pick yourself up and recreate again to get back on the track you wanted to be on?
Yeah, I would like when you were talking about it, I was like thinking, you know, when I get to like a rage point or anger, and, you know, the one thing that I've really honed in on is creating time and distance between stimulus and response. To me, that is like it's so integral, and that would be different for every person. But I think some of the things that I did was I started and I go back to the questions. Like if you ask a quality question, you're going to get a quality answer. There is nothing that we do on a day-to-day basis that doesn't start with a question. You know, before you grab the cup to take a drink, you have to ask yourself, am I thirsty? And it happens fast, and oftentimes it happens subconsciously. And we ask so many questions subconsciously. And like there's a main question called the primary question, that we ask ourselves at a, you know, subconscious level that we created. Unless you've been educated and understand the process of a primary question, you probably created the primary question somewhere in your formative years, somewhere between 2 and 6 years old. And it was typically created most of the times to protect yourself or to get what you wanted because you're young, and that you create this question. It's a question that you constantly ask yourself. And so what I would focus on is like in the very beginning, in order to practice the muscle of stimulus and response, time and distance between stimulus and response, I would find one question. And so, you know, in the early days, I went through the primary question process. My old primary question used to be, am I doing this right? And so that question on its own, am I doing this right? So there's two components to a good primary question. One is like, be aware of what's the presupposition of the question, and 2, what's the downside of the question. And so, am I doing this right? The presupposition of the question is there's a right way to do something. But what's right? Well, I deemed what was right. So the downside to the question is, if people didn't do things, act the way I think was the right way, I would judge them for it. And on the level of extremes, I would go from, you know, just like, you know, pissy pants judgment to anger or rage. And so the question served me in a lot of ways. Like I was raised in an environment, like my parents, God rest their souls, are beautiful parents. Like there's no parent drama from my life. They were amazing. But they did have a specific way of doing things. There's a specific way to cut the grass, a specific way to wash the car, a specific way to do the dishes. You name it, there was a right way to do it. And the right way was how mom and dad taught us. And so my dad would always go, hey, let me show you how to do that right. And so that's what created, I created that question in order to protect myself so that if I did it the right way, then I wouldn't get nagged, or I wouldn't get in shit, or I wouldn't, I would get approval, I would get love, I would get respect or appreciation and all that kind of stuff. And so there was, the things that you avoid and the things that you're moving towards. And so, that's how that primary question kind of came into play. And as I was going through my learnings, I changed the question to what's a powerful choice. And so I went from, am I doing this right, to what's a powerful choice? And then the presupposition of that question is there is a choice, which before there was no choice. It was only the right way being my way. So I shifted the perspective on that. And then powerful, to me, I created a definition at the time. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was, it was empowerment, progress, discipline, integrity, honesty. Those were my kind of definition of powerful. And so and then the downside, so the presupposition was there is a choice and the choice is powerful. So pretty good primary question. And the downside was not really apparent to me.
And it changed the nature of our conversations, like, because I could feel, am I going to get judged? Did I do it right according to what Dwayne's standards were? And all of a sudden it became, we have infinite choices. Which one is the most empowering? And it was just that adaptation alone was transformational.
Yeah. And I hired a coach to help me work through this process. And then since then, I've changed my primary question. And my current primary question is, where's the joy in this? And because, as you know, one day I showed up in actually one of our for the audience, like, we're a group. Curt is one of the members of a mastermind group that we're a part of, with 4 other guys. So there's 6 of us in total. And one day I showed up on a call and I was like, I had mastered the science of achievement, but I had failed in the art of fulfillment. And I was like, I was in this conversation, I remember I'm like, I need more fucking joy in my life. And you guys were like, whoa, well, it sounds joyful, man. And so then I embarked on this was the next level of evolution for me, which these spaced apart by years, like half a dozen years, maybe more. And so I evolved it to, where's the joy in this? Again, the presupposition is there's joy in everything. And there is no downside to not searching for joy. And so, so that was kind of, I think, where it started for me, which was really evolving and identifying primary question. And for those of you guys anybody who's listening who's like, holy geez, like, I resonate with this. There's a chapter in Tony's book, Awaken the Giant Within, that deals with primary question. And I would urge you, like, the primary question is functioning at a unconscious level. And it is something that you are always asking yourself. And if it's a disempowering primary question is, what's wrong with me? Or why does this always happen to me? Or I'm not good enough, and people ask themselves that question. And so I would encourage you, if anybody gets stuck or has a negative primary question that is disempowering them on a continual basis, buy that book or Google and do some, research online on primary question. I'm sure if you Google it, lots of stuff will come up, videos and, content that will help you through the process. And if you probably chat GPT'd it now, it would give you like a step-by-step lesson of how to change your primary question. And it's important to integrate it, right? And that's where the commitment falls in. It's like, the commitment to, creating and changing a new primary question and integrating it into your body. It's like, I used to have it, I would write it and stick it on the front dash of my car. I'd put it on the mirrors. It would be on my fridge. Every time I flipped down the sun visor, they'd be there. I'd have it in my wallet. I'd change my screensaver to my new primary question. Like, it was everywhere I went. I saw it. And over time, and it took, and maybe it's me, maybe because I'm not the crispiest chip in the bag. Like, I am relentless. I am. It is one of the things that I do believe I have an extreme level of is relentlessness. And I probably had to learn that because of, it's like I barely got through school. I read at a very low level. And so I had to be in order to get what I wanted.
I think you're hammering on a huge piece that is a superpower of yours, which is you establish rituals to help pull you to be better than you were. And those rituals, and I've watched you every single time, you talked about mastery. The flip side of mastery is the dabbler. I remember the first time we went through the primary question process, I developed a new primary question. I did not ask myself that primary question every single day. And so 6 months later, it was not part of my unconscious, right? It stopped at conscious competence and I didn't drive it to unconscious competence. And what I've observed you do is take every single new awareness that you come upon is now, I'm going to drive that into a ritual and a habit to make it now an unconscious, an unconsciously competent part of your programming that happens automatically.
Yeah, that's funny. I get, when you said that, like, I get so many people and when I say I'm not the crispiest chip in the bag, and people go, don't beat yourself up like that. I'm like, I'm not beating myself up. It's actually a strength.
You turned it into a superpower.
Right. Like, and this is like, everybody's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness, but their greatest weakness can also be their greatest strength. And because I struggled in learning, and because I struggled in reading, it forced me to have to create these rituals to do it over and over and over again. It was a little exhausting. And when I was younger and didn't understand it, it was hard. But the fucking hard things in life are what help us transform into who we become. It's like a caterpillar to a butterfly. It's like so many people. It's the one thing that probably I get worried about society now the most, is because it feels like people are shying away from doing the hard thing. And for me, and I'm projecting, I'm sure, I'm aware that I'm projecting, but it's been so helpful to me that doing the hard things over and over and over again have been a secret sauce for me. And so you can be pretty much guaranteed I'm going to show up prepared. And I'm not going to do something that I'm ill prepared to enter. And so, that was part of it. It's like, yeah, it's like, and I mean, when you just had mentioned mastery, right? It's like, when you go to those 4 levels of mastery, it's like, okay, skills is number 1. And I don't, this is not, I don't know if this is in a textbook anywhere. Like sometimes, you read so much, you don't know if you created something or thought of it or, and you steal bits and pieces, of course. Like I don't have any original content, but some of it's just put together differently from, because you read one thing, go, oh, that's interesting. And then it's like, oh, I could add this to that. But it's like, from a mastery standpoint, it's like skill. So I went skill, right? Intellectual knowledge. But then it's like, that second level is managing state, that the physiology, the language, the focus of, what do you focus on a consistent basis? I mean, I think that, one thing that I had up on my wall as a kid from, I think, the age of 16, and I don't think I took it off until, I think I took it off when I was 29 when I got married. Because I think we got new furniture in the mirror. I was like, okay, well, we'll rip this off. But it said, attitude is everything, keep yours positive. And that one statement, I read it for, what is that, 30 years, or not 30 years, sorry, 20 years, 15, 20 years. I read that every day, multiple times a day, because I just saw it. And I think it really programmed my mind to think about, the positive side of things. And so I'm very fortunate to have that. I got it at a student leadership conference when I was 16 years old. And my buddy, I was smoking pot and hanging out with the wrong people. And my buddy Claire Shantz, who invited me to go to this student leadership conference, and that dude saved my life. He's been one of my best friends, and as best friends go, you don't talk to them. You get disconnected. He lives there, I live here, wherever, and there's distance between us. But when I look back and I go, that was one of the turning points in my life, is him inviting me to that thing. And I got that little banner that said, attitude is everything, keep yours positive. I put it up on my mirror and I saw it 1 million times over the course of 20 years. But it helps me with my state, it helps me with that focus and the language that I speak to myself in, and my physiology. And I love working out. I love training. I have a belief that if I exercise my body and my body is strong and my mind is strong, then everything is connected and it leads into emotional resilience.
The image in my mind that keeps coming forward, and I had no idea we'd go here, but Darren Hardy's Compound Effect. And I love that book that we read during the early years when we met. And how do I now take all the little victories and all of a sudden they compound beyond anything I could ever imagine? And so it's the compound effect of, I got up, I did my workout, I got up at the time I said I was going to do, I did all those little things. So your mind is not ready when you hit on something hard. I've already done what I said I was going to do the first 25 times today. So of course I'm going to do it the next time.
Yeah. The 26th time is just automatic, right? And it just comes from within, right? It's, I don't know what the word is for that, but it is, I don't know if you have a word for that, but what was that book called, just for the audience?
Darren Hardy wrote a book called The Compound Effect. And when I read it, it is the embodiment of the intellectual knowledge of everything that you have embodied. And I found the concept so fantastic because once you read it, I couldn't unsee the exponential impact they had. A great example of somebody had 250 calories extra per day. Somebody started working out and have 250 calories less. Course of the first 36 months, there's no real impact, but all of a sudden, the compound effect over time changes your life, changes your health, changes your well-being, changes like your relationships. Everything starts to now compound up or compound down. And I watch that right now at closing on 50. The compound effect of the last 30 years really starts to show up on everyone around me. You can see the impact of all the things the little habits that may or may not have shown up day to day to day, but all of a sudden over a 50-year run makes a massive change.
Well, I mean, it's true, right? Like even today, like some people say to me, like, "Hey, how do you keep in shape? Like, you're 53, you got a six pack and whatever, da da da." And it's like, well, 35 years ago, I started. No, 38. It's actually 38 years ago. 38 years ago, I started working out in my basement, and I have not stopped ever since. That's the compound effect, right? It's like my wife. She gets like, she's like, I can't believe, like, how do you do that? Like, you change your diet. And in 4 weeks, you're in like, you've elevated and changed your physique in a significant way. And it's like the body knows, man. It's like when you have done it over and over and over again, like you said, it's like I've done it 25 times already today. And on the 26th, I know it's going to happen. It comes right from within. And the body is more powerful than we think. And the mind is ultra more powerful. So, and that's the whole, it's like, I mean, I just swing back and finish up mastery, right? We had skills, state, standards is the third one. Is like, you've got to create a level of standard for yourself. Like, what are you willing to commit in order to get to where you want to be? And it's not about necessarily getting to where you want to be, but it's about the process of that, walking that line, taking that journey, moving through the path, and who you become on that journey is where we fulfill ourselves at the highest level. Not necessarily getting the outcome, but having those standards around, what you're willing to commit and what you're willing to accept in your life. We've said it before. It's like, you get what you tolerate in life. And so, the higher the standards, and standards are different than expectations, right? There's a distinct difference. And I struggled with that because I was a judger, right? Like I was, when I was, am I doing this right? My primary question led me to judge many things. And it is hands down my biggest Achilles heel in my personality, hands down. And it is something that I am so acutely aware of now, where I'm like, and I start to see myself doing it. And then I'm like, okay, I gotta somehow wheel myself out of this and start peeling back. And then it's just like, I move from judgment to questions. That's my strategy. My strategy is, rather than judge the situation, ask some questions about the situation, which ultimately leads to, in order to influence somebody, because when we're judging them, we're ultimately, well, I mean, there's a couple things at play, but one of the things is we're trying to either control the situation or try to get an outcome or do what we want. And in order to influence someone, you need to know what influences them. So the only way to find out what influences them is ask them questions. And so I think those are, I mean, three of the key components of like skills, state, standards. But the fourth one that is like, to me, really resonated, especially over the last few years, is save room for grace. Just save room for grace. Trust that the universe, like we talked earlier, was, so if you look back on your past and you said, like, I would never predict how I would have gotten to this place in my life, along this pathway, like you can never predict that. And that's where grace shows up. It guides us, and whatever people want to believe, whether it's God, grace, the universe, spirituality, like whatever it is, it's just save room for that to show up. Because I think when you do things consistently over time with the right intention, with the right integrity, the universe reciprocates that. And I gotta say, like, over the years when I look back on that, like, I have to like equate it, probably if I had to put a number to it, like 20% of the results of my life. It's just where I go, like, you know what? I'm just going to stop. I'm going to pump the brakes here, and I'm not going to drive my agenda. I'm going to accept what is. I'm going to surrender to what grace or the universe has to offer and what will bring to me. And it's like every time something shows up, and it's like, it's beautiful, because you go, like, there's a higher play going on here. And I just finished a book. I literally just finished a book like couple days ago, called Many Minds, Many Masters, and it's a book about who's the author? Brian Weiss, Gary Weiss or Brian Weiss, but it's a book about reincarnation. This is like a fascinating book about the story of this lady who had lived several lives, and he's a psychiatrist, and his journey to accept, their therapy and what they took them through. And it's like, my God, like, it's crazy. And I don't have any answers towards it, but I have a belief that it'll show up, and it's never failed me.
We've just gone to a space that our relationship, I've never connected this, but as I listened to you walk through all of those tools, one of the things I've observed in life is a lot of people have a lot of tools, but the tools without the energy, the battery to use them, is worthless. And so not only do you have the tools, but your word was commitment. What I felt as you talked about that commitment, the thing that drew you with that commitment was love. And that to me is the force that comes through that has pulled you to continue to innovate and evolve. It feels like that's your superpower of love for yourself, love for other humans, love for your life has given you the commitment to drive that. Has that been the battery for you that has given you the energy to sustain and endure across all those challenges?
I don't think, yes, you're 100% accurate. I don't know if I've ever actually thought about it like that. But I do know that, when I do my values, my number one moving towards value is love. And so there's no question that is a driver for me. I mean, it's one of the things that's the reason why I do the podcast. So like, I don't make any money on this. It takes a lot of time, and I spend a lot of money on it, but I love it because I'm contributing, and our guests are contributing. I'm a conduit to bringing guests to the audience and to the listener to help them elevate in a place. And to me, I mean, being in service of others. So, that I think that's another one too, but I think that's grouped into love. Yeah. I mean, you go back to those, the forces at play. It's like, values, beliefs, and rules. It's like, what are you moving towards values? What are you moving away from values? I mean, those are important to be able to understand. And then, when we talk about, values, beliefs, and rules, it's like, those values are those emotional pieces, those emotional things that we're in search of. If it's love, freedom, acceptance, success, and then, the values of rejection, disappointment, neglect. Where do those rank? What's your number one moving towards value? What's your moving away from value? And then more importantly, what are your rules around those? It's like, you have to be careful. And that one thing I would point out, since we started talking about, the value of love, it's like, well, what are your rules around love? If your rules around love are, in order to feel loved, I can never be rejected. Well,
Tough road.
I mean, you're going to have a hard time feeling love because rejection's a part of life, and you can't control rejection. Like, that's the other bigger piece, is like, there's no way in the process that you can control, a rejection. And so right now, then all of a sudden you've set up yourself for an instant, violation to your rules that meet your number one most important value. And if you're moving towards value is rejection, and your number one rule for rejection is, in order to be, to not feel rejected, nobody can dismiss me or ignore me. So, you will never feel loved, and you will often feel rejected. And so then we wonder why we can't meet our number one driving value. Forget about number two or number three. And when you start to list out all these rules, and it's important to be very careful about, what rules are and how, secret to happiness is to have fewer rules. The fewer the rules, the greater the opportunity or ability to have happiness in your life, because then you're not so rigid and you're more accepting. And the rules, and they're just not rules just for that are blended into values. They're a really important piece, but just there's rules for life. It's like, and they show up like, well, if somebody does this, then, I'll do that. But it's important to, that was one of the things I started to do, was I started dropping off a bunch of rules. Once I started to figure out, like, holy shit, my primary question is, am I doing this right? And then therefore I would judge people if I thought I would judge. I remember sitting at a airline counter, and that girl was, she may have been new. She might've been training. She might've been having a bad day, whatever it was. She was not operating at her optimal. And I remember sitting across the counter, and I'm like, holy fuck. And I'm completely judging her. And I caught myself going, wait a second. This is, what's the opposite of the feeling that I have right now, which is like frustration, disappointment, being completely judgmental. And the opposite of that would be accepting, loving, caring. And I just started changing and asking her questions about herself and who she was and what she does and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, and then she started to light up, and I started to realize, I can give people a gift by making them feel special, by making them feel valued, by not making them feel judged. And before, I would meet my needs by judging, because I would be able to connect with myself. I felt significant because I just felt they were like, I would do it this way. That'd be a better way. So I'm smarter than them. So now I'm more significant. I have way more certainty. So I was meeting my needs at a high level by judging people. But I realized I could meet my, or what I didn't realize, I found once I started exercising that muscle of, the opposite, the helping, the supporting, the asking questions, understanding, being more empathetic. It was like I met my needs at a way higher level and way higher needs for growth, contribution, love and connection. And it just, and that fuels us. And so if we can find ways to meet our needs at higher levels, it changes the game for us and it changes the game for others. But anyway, sorry.
And I love how one of my beliefs the older I get is that I realize we're each in a different world. We may be on the same blue and green marble, but we're in very different worlds. And so I love that last story about the airline attendant, because you literally went and took her from one world when you were driving her down one train. And all of a sudden, when you changed, she metamorphosized into a completely different world. And I've seen that happen so many times. And someone were to look at you and say, you must have been lucky. To me, that's creating your own luck, is showing up in a way that allows someone who might have been frustrating, troublesome, difficult, all of a sudden they're showing up super helpful and excited because they're now in a peak state. You've now put them into a place where they have a completely different capability than the one they would have had any other way.
100%. Yeah. It's absolutely 100%.
You talk about growth. I thought I was driven until my son was born. And so the most humbling thing for me in life has been, as a parent, I am often at my worst in my fear for how I show up for my kids. And watching how you've been a parent to Spencer has been extraordinary. I love the distinction you got from the Tony Robbins event in Mexico. If you don't mind sharing that, I think it's really powerful in how to become the parent that you would like to become instead of the parent that is fearful and controlling for their child's future.
Yeah, listen, I mean, it's a great question. And there's two sides to that, right? Because I have two children from two different mothers. And, there's in some ways, I don't get to see my daughter very often. And for whatever reason is irrelevant. Because that's really not what it's about. That's the event. That's the fact. I have to, adjust the meaning for it in order for me to have a positive emotion. And it's one of it's like children are like to me, our greatest teachers. And I've learned so much.
Unequivocally.
I've learned so much from both my children. I've learned, consequences to your actions, to your thinking, to your behavior, to your, and mistakes are costly. And that, that's like kind of one of the things that I've learned. And I lost time with my daughter, and it's, I don't have any regrets in my life because I learned a lot from that, and it's helped craft me. But I certainly don't, ever want to threaten that relationship ever again. With my son, the biggest lesson that I learned, with him was I came home from an event, and I mean, I was very rules driven. Much like, on a spiral dynamics, like consciousness level, I was very like blue, very like, rules, faith, like, yeah. And when I was, that's how I raised him. I was raising him in a way that was very restrictive, very confined, and very controlling. It was like, and the control was from a certainty perspective. It's like, well, if I don't do this, if he's not a good boy, like, and it's sometimes significance, right? It's like, if he doesn't grow up to be a good boy, then people will judge me as a parent, and, I failed and I failed him. And so there's loving connection that plays in there. And so I found myself, I gained an immense realization. He was 8 years old, maybe 8 years old. And I remember coming home from that trip, and I sat in his bed, and I was like, I said to him, I said, son, like, the way I've parented you has not been optimal. I've projected what I want in this world for you onto you. And that's not fair. You're not me. You're not my mom. You're not my dad. And I don't want, and I mean, quite frankly, I remember saying, like, I failed at my outcome to have you grow up as a strong, resilient, young man, because I'm weakening you by the influence that I'm putting on you. And I'm going to try really, really hard. And I'm not going to be perfect at this. But I'm going to try really, really hard. And as we're talking about, like, or as well as I was talking about it, because at 7 or 8 years old, I'm not even sure he fucking understood. But it was more about me expressing it and apologizing for it. And I don't even know if he would remember it today. I haven't, we haven't talked about that. Well, I don't think we've ever talked about it. But I remember realizing, like, I'm crying and I just, I knew, like, I got to be more. I got to be more open. That was the leverage to create a lot of change for me, because just the realization that I did it, like, how you do anything is how you do everything. And so that realization of what I was doing with him was an extension of what I was doing everywhere, in my business, to myself, in my intimate relationships. And that was another turning point in my life about how, and that would have been back in 2008, 2009. So at that stage, I am, 39 years old? Yeah. It's a long time to learn a lesson, but grateful that I learned the lesson. And from that day forward, I changed how, and it was not easy. And I made a lot of mistakes. Like, wasn't perfect, still not perfect, like still make the same mistakes. We all do it. Difference is today, I don't beat myself up for it like I used to. I used to beat the shit out of myself, emotionally, mentally, not physically. But I used to beat myself down for the mistakes that I would make. And, but now I look back on it and I'm like, it was the big changing point, because I just changed philosophically how I looked and how I wanted to raise him, and letting him, having more discussion about, at that point we created our culture rules, for our house. It's, be part of the solution, show others you care, and pursue excellence. And, so that allowed me, creating those principles allowed me to have a conversation with him, especially when, he's a kid, he's going to do stupid shit. And so he would do something stupid. And I'd be like, okay, like, dude, like, our 3 principles, like, how are you pursuing excellence? How are you showing others you care? How are you being part of the solution? And it's like, so we had a different level of conversation about stuff like that. And I would stop trying to project what I thought he should do and give him the option to make more decisions. If he's holding a loaded gun, obviously we're going to step in, but there were many times where it was like, you just look at it and go, oh, this is going to go so bad. This is like a catastrophically stupid thing to do. But it's like, all right, dude, this is what you want to do, man. I'm with you.
And the reason I think this is such a powerful vignette is there's a false rumor in the world that good guys lose, right? Or you have to cut corners to win. And to me, what I've experienced watching you in life is the leverage that you've had for change has been driven by following your passion for others, following your desire to be a servant leader. That was one of the most catalytic moments I watched in your life when you pivot and said, I have to do this for my son. Like, I'm going to pivot this. I've watched you do it for Tennille. I've watched you do it for many people you care about. You're like, hey, the level I played at is not sufficient. And I've seen you have drive for yourself, but I've seen 10x drive to change you for others.
Yeah, thanks for the thank you.